This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, everybody, let us begin. We're very lucky today to have Professor Libby Porter come and speak to us on this topic, on which she is a recognised expert not only in this country but globally. It's a great privilege to have Professor Porter here. Libby, is there anything else I should say?
No, just call me Libby. That's the main thing.
Just call her Libby. And so she will, about an hour, Libby will talk for, and then there will be some time for questions after that as well. So you should feel free to take advantage of that situation. So Libby, please.
Great, thanks very much, David. First of all, can you all hear me? Am I on a microphone somehow? Okay, excellent. I can't hear that from here. Thanks very much for having me along. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the place where we're meeting has been a place of teaching and learning, of sharing knowledge, of stretching horizons, of participating in the production of new knowledge for hundreds of generations. And in doing so, we acknowledge that we're not new to this place, and we're meeting on the unceded sovereign territory of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and emerging in the future, and we pay our respects also to the Indigenous people on whose lands perhaps we each occupy in various different ways in which our lives are entangled with in all sorts of other parts of the globe and all other aspects of our lives. I'd like to also acknowledge Indigenous people in the room, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or other Indigenous people from elsewhere. My respects to you if you're here today. So we're going to talk today about this relationship between that statement that I just made, which is an invitation to think about our responsibility as perhaps planners, if that's how you think of yourself, or as people who are involved in something to do with the relationship between people and place, and interventions in the relationship between people and place, whatever that may mean to you. That's how I kind of think of planning in its broadest sense. So that set of interventions and that set of activities, the discipline, if you like, and Indigenous peoples. What is that relationship like historically and in contemporary terms? And what are some of the problems and challenges and issues in that relationship, that exist in that relationship? So we're going to try and sort of unsettle a few ideas that are a bit prevalent in some of our discussions in contemporary life, particularly in Australia, but elsewhere as well, in relation to planning and Indigenous peoples. And particularly these two key words that I've put little scare quotes around here, by and for, or with perhaps, and think about how we might trouble some of those terms. So just in thinking about terms, what do we mean by some of these words that we're using? So first of all, who are Indigenous people? There is an accepted definition of indigeneity, and that is people who are recognised in themselves, are self-identifying as Indigenous peoples from wherever they come from whichever part of the globe they come. I don't mean just here in Australia. And who are recognised by others as a part of a community and who share a heritage with those people. So that's our kind of definition of indigeneity. And in Australia, in the Australian context, of course, we tend to use the terms Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, which are equally, I guess, awkward sorts of terms in some respects, just like the term Indigenous is, because it tends to kind of collapse a whole range of identities and law systems and cultures and histories into one category, or two categories in that case, I guess. But that's the language that we have. So where I can, I will use the specific names of peoples and nations, and where we're talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian context, I'll try and use Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and sometimes Indigenous when my tongue starts to trip over all of those syllables. And I'll tend to use Indigenous when I mean across the globe under that kind of catch-all phrase. So that's the kind of terminology that I'll use today. And what I mean by planning is a bit what I talked about just before. I don't mean planning in the kind of narrow statutory sense of, you know, there is a development proposal and we will stamp it. That's not my view of planning. Planning to me is much broader than that, and it's really about how we govern our relationship between people and our environment, between us and our environment, what that means. So that's how I'm thinking about planning, and we'll talk about some specific examples. And then I guess there's the troubling question of who are we, and perhaps particularly who am I, to talk about to, with or for Indigenous people in this context. As a non-Indigenous person from settler heritage, so my history in this context is as someone whose life is supported by modes of dispossession of Indigenous peoples that have been in place for a very long time, for more than 200 years. I'm the bearer of privilege in that respect. And yet there are ways in which people like me, and perhaps this is people like you too if you come from a similar settler kind of context, there are ways in which we can think about our responsibility and take seriously a responsibility and commitment to and with and for and by Indigenous peoples in a planning context. And then there's the other slightly interesting question about, well, if you're not from here, right here, in the Australian context, or here, Victoria, or here, Naarm, Melbourne, Naarm being the Woiwurrung word for this region, of the local language of Wurundjeri people and shared language with others. If you're not from here, what does it mean to think about these kinds of questions? Maybe you don't ever think that you will practice, for example, in this context. So why then have this discussion? And there's a couple of reasons why I think it's important. The first is you're here now. And if you're here now, you exist and your life is supported by unceded territory, by land and country, in the terminology that we use here. And so that brings a responsibility to think about what that means for you in your life here, right at this moment, and your practice. But also, so second point, is wherever you might end up around the world, many of these colonial histories and tricky post-colonial contexts will be part of what it's like to practice wherever you find yourself. And so it's really important then that we try and situate a kind of local experience of this, what I'm going to talk about here, into many, many other kinds of contexts and experiences. And I think you'll find some resonance, hopefully, with those things. So there's a few terms, I guess. Okay, so we'll look today across, as I said, a sort of historical relationship, thinking about planning, as I tend to think about it, as a kind of technology of colonisation, remaining actually a technology of colonisation, but is being kind of unsettled in different kinds of ways. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the contemporary relationship between planning systems, planning profession, wider kind of policy areas that manage land use, decision-making about land, and Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples specifically here in Australia. So we'll talk a little bit about what's called native title, some of the land rights regimes, and also cultural heritage as sort of three dimensions in which that contemporary relationship unfolds and is experienced. And there's a few kind of key dimensions that I want you to be thinking about as I'm talking, and perhaps we can have a conversation about later on. And they are these. That colonialism, and this is really important, is not a past event. It didn't happen in the example of where we stand right now, in Naarm, Melbourne, in 1835 when John Batman arrived, and then that was done. And it's all over now. Colonialism exists, it continues to exist, it actually structures our ongoing relationship, whoever we are in this room, to this place. It continues to do so. So it's not a past, in the famous words of Patrick Wolf, who helped found and bring about a really important area of scholarship, a disciplinary scholarship called settler colonial studies. He says settler colonialism is not an event; it's a structure. So it's not a thing that happened in the past, a moment in the past. It actually continues to evolve in today's world. And the second key dimension that I want you to be kind of thinking about is the question of sovereignty, which is a really tricky word because it means different. It's very fickle. It means different things in different contexts. For example, if you were to hear Malcolm Turnbull talk about sovereignty with a big capital S, he would generally be talking about it in terms of like the sovereign debt crisis or our sovereign right to protect our borders, for example. As a symbol of, and indeed the practice of, the authority to say what can happen in any given territory. So sovereignty is about power and it's about territory put together in that context. Now, when we hear Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people or Indigenous people elsewhere talk about sovereignty, and that's not a globally used term, but is a common term that we hear in the Australian context, it's a slightly different kind of thing. There is still the question of authority and territory combined, so people who consider that their sovereignty still matters and still exists and was never ceded, never given away, no one ever asked for Indigenous peoples to give up their land. That sovereignty, however, means something slightly different. It has a different kind of set of characteristics and relationships that come with it. But my point here, we can't go into that too much today. There'll be a little kind of glimpse at some point when in the lecture when I show you a little video. But I want you to remember that sovereignty really matters in this. So the sovereign rights and authority of the settler government, the settler colonial government, right? The one we think of when we think of planning, and the planning system is a sovereign practice, but equally Indigenous planning, if you like, the planning of Wurundjeri people of their country is a sovereign practice too, and they both exist at the same time. One is obviously vastly more powerful than the other, but they still both exist. And the third dimension I want you to think about, and this is a kind of tricky one, and we'll try and grapple with this a little bit, is the very slippery nature of the word inclusion and the other words that kind of signify inclusion, like participation or engagement, those kinds of things. And I'll try and talk a little bit more about that, but I just want you to hold it for a moment and to remember that when we're talking about planning by, for, with Indigenous people, I'm not talking about inclusiveness, because inclusiveness suggests that there is an us, which is usually white folk, like me, in a settler government context, inviting other people in to our system so that they can be included in our system. That's not what sovereignty is about. Sovereignty is not about that. Sovereignty is about understanding that there are two or more, many in fact, hundreds of law systems, sovereign law systems in the Australian context, and one recognised sovereign government. So what's the relationship between those? It can't be a question of inclusiveness, it has to be something else. So we want to grapple a little bit more with the notion of inclusion. Okay, so that's where we're going. Bit of an intro with some key dimensions. So I just want to talk briefly at the moment about this idea of planning being a sort of central technology of colonisation, because it's possibly a little bit controversial. It's not to me, because I think I've been talking about it for like 20 years, so it feels to me like it's just totally normal. But sometimes when I mention this to other folk, they find that a little bit confronting. So let me talk you through how I see this, how I see planning as a central tool of colonisation. Here's a map that may or may not be familiar, but we're not quite on this map because we're a little to the north of it, but this is a map of Melbourne from a reasonably early date in the city's founding and building and developing. I can't remember exactly when now, but that shows us some of the processes by which the city came to exist. So if you think about how did we come to be here right now in this classroom? How does this classroom exist? If you think that it was only in 1835 that this classroom did not exist like this, other classrooms in a very loose sense of the word, existed, but not like this. So how in a very short space of time has this come to be, and that we are only now grappling, I would argue, with this relationship between planning Indigenous peoples. And one of the key ways in which that has been enabled is, of course, through the disciplines and practices of planning. Now, planning, as I'm sure you know, because you're all good students of the history of planning, right? You would know that planning was not a profession when this map was drawn, right? Because it came much later than that. But all of the tools that we are familiar to us as planners, right? Zoning and drawing maps and surveying land and organising, you know, land titles through registry systems and deciding on policy to determine what will go where on this map, where will the church be and where will the open space be and how will the road networks function, the infrastructure provision, all of those things are planning. Yeah, that's what we recognise today as planning. In all of its various ways. So the tools of planning, of course, long predated the moment of the profession. So when I say planning is a technology of colonisation, I'm not saying that planning as a profession existed at the moment of this particular event of colonisation, but that the technologies of planning that we recognise as such were present. And that they were part of that. So to produce a city like Melbourne, you've got to first of all, of course, steal the land if it's somebody else's. So that was successfully largely achieved from Wurundjeri people and other Kulin Nation peoples. And then you have to do things to that land, carve it up into good chunks that are marketable, that become recognisable to markets, that you can sell, you can build things on, that you can create policy for, that you can connect via road systems and use rivers and resources and all of those things. It's all planning, doing that work, literally creating the space that is Melbourne, creating the place that is Melbourne. So planning was fundamental to that. Another way of thinking about that is through the lens of a particular site that is a little bit dear to my heart because it's so fascinating and interesting, and I'm hoping that you might think so too. It's a site just down the road from here. Part of it is actually RMIT land because it just sits behind the RMIT Design Hub on the corner of Victoria Street and Swanston Street. Can you imagine roughly where I am? So we're a little bit further to the north, of course, on this map. So let's have a think about how we might use that site. I'll tell you a little story about this site to expose these kind of layers of processes of colonisation and how colonisation actually works, and therefore how we might think differently about questions like sovereignty and inclusion and indigeneity in relation to planning. Okay, so the first thing to say, of course, is that Melbourne is Aboriginal land. I've said that already, but just to show you in more context what that looks like, or what one way of thinking about what that looks like, because of course this is just one sort of fairly bland representation of it. These are the language groups of the area now known as Victoria. And you can perhaps see roughly where Melbourne is, and that the language group Woiwurrung covers most of the area of Melbourne, but the other language group is the Boonwurrung speaking language group, who are sometimes also the Bunurong people. They have different ways of pronouncing their name, but Boonwurrung is the name of the language, and Wathaurong to the west, over towards sort of Werribee and past Werribee towards Geelong. So these are the sovereign nations and language-speaking groups that make up what is now Victoria and particularly Melbourne. So this is a different way of thinking about, if you like, the political geography of this city. Not by local government areas or state governments or catchment management authorities or whatever, but this is a political geography as well, because this tells us who are sovereign peoples where, over which country, over which territory. Okay, so having said that, what happened to create this place? Have you heard of this man, John Batman? You hear his name around a bit. Various things are named after him, sadly, and perhaps no one's heard of John Batman. Wow. Okay, so John Batman is a very important figure. He is a much reviled figure in the history of this place, in the history of Victoria. So in 1835, to cut a very, very long story short, he was hanging out down in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, saw that there was really nice open country hanging down here, over here in what has become Victoria, in Port Phillip, and thought it would be kind of cool to get over there, despite the fact that the Crown authorities really didn't want any more spread of colonisation at that point, because they were having trouble at that point kind of keeping control of squatters and various other crazy things going on. They were trying to contain what they called the limits of settlement, or limits of colonisation. But John and his party of sort of speculators thought, sod that, let's cross anyway. So they came across in a boat with a whole bunch of cattle and sheep and a dog, I think, and a cat and a couple of blokes, and stole the land, basically. And they did so by forming what is called a treaty, but never was a terrible farce, really, but is known as the Batman Treaty, with Wurundjeri people and Kulin Nations leaders, so elders Narangita, chief clan headsman of the time. And this is an artist's depiction of that event, where he claims that people signed away their land to him across a vast acreage of land, apparently picking up a pen and signing their names on parchment, having never seen parchment before. It seems an unlikely prospect that that would happen. And he claims to have, walked the territory with these people and have, given them, I don't know, axes and beads and stuff, and flour and whatever for this transaction to take place. So this is the infamous Batman Treaty of 1835. That was the moment of the founding of Melbourne. From the perspective of Wurundjeri people and other Aboriginal people now, in contemporary Melbourne, this is a farce, right? No one agreed to anything, and some of the historical research, really good historical research, go and read Bruce Pascoe's book, Convincing Ground, on this one, indicates that he made it up. Basically, he drew the map on the boat, he came over, he forged people's signatures because people didn't write, they had other means of communication, and it was a total farce. So that is the way that Melbourne was founded. From the perspective of the colonial authorities, this was an illegal act. He had no authority to do this from the perspective of the Crown, or the perspective of what was then the Sydney, based in Sydney, was then the home of the colonial government in what was then not yet New South Wales. So this moment of founding Melbourne is a kind of speculative act of really grotesque land theft, and sparked such a quick wave of colonisation, of interest in the area, because of course Batman and his friends brought enormous investment. They had enormous investment clout to bring to this event, and so colonisation spread, so settlement spread very, very, very rapidly. In fact, it was one of the swiftest moments of dispossession in British imperial history. Something like 2.5 million square kilometres of land was dispossessed in about 14 or 15 years from this date, 1835. So people arrived in great numbers, sheep and cattle arrived in great numbers, and stole the land. As a result of that, of course, we had to make a city. So there was that famous line that I think actually never got spoken. This is this is the place for a village, and of course this was it. This is the early depiction of Melbourne. This is 1838, looking from the artist's perspective, from the position across the river, looking up the way to an emerging urban settlement, an emerging conglomeration of roads and pieces of infrastructure and housing and services and the like. So literally the tools of planning, surveying, mapping, laying out roads, building houses, built form, emerging, is dispossessing land as it happens. That's the practice of doing it. It's how you do it, how colonisation works. So if we think about then this site on the corner of Victoria and Swanston, in the context of this map, we can see sort of roughly where it is. I meant to mark it out. It's right at the top. It's actually off the grid here. So when Hoddle laid his grid, he just did the first bit first, obviously, and sold those lots and made a squillion, by the way, as many people did, and then moved further north and sort of created what's sort of north of Latrobe Street, basically, from up there. So we're not quite on this map yet, but that's how this site came to exist. That's how we have come to exist here in this classroom, of course. So if you're imagining this corner, you can perhaps imagine the building that's on this corner. Before I show the next slide, does anyone know the building that's on this corner, just that sits behind RMIT's dreadful supposed design hub, which is a kind of thing with weird discs? Yeah.
I don't know the name of it.
Yep.
It's the one with the Willem Barak on it.
That's the one. This building, yeah? Have you seen this building? Yeah? And the further you walk down Swanston Street, the more his image appears, although he is peering over the top of the design hub in a slightly awkward way, I think, which is a little bit of an unfortunate design feature, but never mind, we won't talk about that for today. But this is you're right, this is the contemporary side of what I call the Barrack Building, and in sort of shorthand terms is called the Barrack Building, although I think its official name is the Portrait Building. So this how can this building come to be? To fill in the details, this is the face of William Barrack, who was, for Wurundjeri people, they would call him the last Narangita, the last head man of the Wurundjeri people. At the time of colonisation, as a boy, he was present at the signing, supposed signing, of Batman's Treaty. He was there. And so in the space of that time, we have stolen the land, created the city, created the site, and then put his face on the front of a high-end commercial apartment building. How is that possible? What does that tell us about the relationship between built environment professions, planning policy and urban policy, and Indigenous people? So, I was going to tell you a little bit about the history of this site, but I feel like I've kind of wandered around a history a fair bit. But I did want to just say a couple of key things about this site to pull out some of the contradictions of this particular building. This site was a brewery. You probably knew that because on the Malt House side of it, if you catch the tram down Swanston Street, of course, you can see the old facade of the Malt House, which I think is still called the Malt House from memory, and it's still got its red brick facade there. This is a really early picture, the earliest one I can find of it as originally a brewery, and it changed hands a number of times. There was quite a lot of speculative activity going on around this site because beer brewing was a very lucrative, thank you very much, industry in early colonial Melbourne, as I'm sure you can imagine. But the original owners who set it up in this picture went bust a couple of years later, and then it sort of lay dormant for a little while, a couple of years, and then someone else came along and bought it and recreated a brewery again on the site, and eventually, after a series of company sales and various other things, it became Carlton and United Brewery. I love this picture because it's like straight out of 1970s Melbourne. Which was a really important kind of icon at the top of Swanston Street for a long time. I can remember this as a kid, so you can tell how old I am now, where you used to look up Swanston Street past the green and yellow trams, and there was Carlton United Brewery sitting right at the top there, and you could, of course, always smell the yeasty smell that breweries produce, and it was a really important site of employment and, kind of iconic site for the production of a apparently peculiarly Melbourne beverage for a very long time. So CUB has kind of got this gravitas around its history, but that's where it came from the dispossession, of course, of these people. So here is this brewery. It's no longer a brewery, but it is still slightly celebrated as a brewery with the Malt House. And if you go in, by the way, sorry, I'm jumping about here, but if you must go into the bottom of this building, because the entrance to the apartment complex is a whole series of pictures about the brewing history of this site. So it mentions nothing at all about the face of the man on the front of the building, just, you know, when you go through, that you end up in, if you're an apartment dweller in this complex, mentions nothing about that, but it talks all about the history of brewing in a kind of quite triumphalist, deeply white, deeply male way, probably deeply heteronormative as well. I haven't done an analysis of that aspect of it, but I'm sure it's that too. So there is a number of contradictions here. Okay, so we've got William Barak, last Narangita of his people, as the Wurundjeri people would describe him, they're not my words, a famous land rights activist in Victoria, famously marched to Parliament many, many times advocating on behalf of his people, who himself was involved in what became a very successful, albeit very brief, business in hops growing, feeding the brewing industry at the Corandurk Mission, which is out past Healesville, another place to go if you're looking for places to go in Melbourne. Beautiful area, now owned by Wurundjeri people because the land was handed back. So he was significantly involved in hops growing enterprises, feeding exactly this brewery, probably, growing hops to come here. Now finding his face on the front of a commercial apartment building that, according to the planning documents as to why this got approved, how this building got approved and how the proponents of the building, the developer is Grocon, so the Rollo family, well-known and controversial property developers in Melbourne. The reason that this building is considered a landmark icon is because it faces towards, down the civic spine, Swanston Street, to the War Memorial, which famously does not recognise any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander fallen soldiers, nor does it recognise, of course, the war that went on prior to all of these events and during all of these events that dispossessed this site to enable this man's face to be on the building. So we have this extraordinary set of contradictions personified, exemplified in this one building with this one man's face staring down Swanston Street. So I think this is a really useful kind of tool for thinking about these contradictions and sort of problematics. And so I want to move now into the kind of that contemporary relationship, thinking about how did this building come to be like this, and who said it was okay for that to be so, and how might we think about some of these kinds of contradictions. So to do that, I want us to think for a moment about two things that structure the contemporary relationship, basically, between the planning system, if you like, or in its, I don't just mean the sort of statutory planning system, I mean the kind of broad thing that produces the built environment. So anything to do with producing the built environment is under planning system. And the system of what I've called here formal recognition of Indigenous peoples and how they come together to produce what we've called in this work the contact zone. So the space where these two things have come to meet and are really now structuring processes of inclusion, participation and engagement, there's those three tricky words I mentioned before, between planning and Indigenous peoples. And some of this contact zone moment produces this building. That's why I want to talk about it. So the planning system often creates, as it does for all forms of participation and engagement, the kind of how. It creates expectations for how Indigenous people might get involved. So, you know, as good urban policy makers, we would say, well, we must invite people, stakeholders, if you like, to the table to participate in decision-making processes, and people will have a say, and then we'll do forms of consultation. That sounds fairly familiar, right? So those kinds of things about how, processes of people being involved and included in planning decision-making. And then there's the formal recognition space, which often defines why government seeks to work with Indigenous peoples. And this is really important because the why shapes, to some degree, the how, but also shapes the kind of contact zone that gets produced. Okay, so I'm going to try and tease that out a little bit more for you as to how and why that works in the formal recognition space. So the first aspect of the formal recognition space between, and here we're talking specifically about the Australian context. So apologies that I'm having to come really, really local now in terms of the sort of political and legal context here. Who has heard of the name Eddie Mabo? Excellent. A handful of people, yay, excellent. Okay, so Eddie Mabo was a Miriam Island man, a Torres Strait Islander man who took a case to the High Court and made history, as this newspaper article tells us, when the High Court found in his favour, when he sought the determination of the High Court to say that when what was then the British Crown annexed his island to the British Crown and said this is now British sovereign territory, right, his island, that his sovereignty was unceded and his title, and his people's title, by his I mean his people's title, to that land was not extinguished. That never ceased. And the High Court agreed with him. The High Court said, yes, we agree with that. And in that moment, the High Court overturned what had come to be known as the doctrine of terra nullius, the doctrine of land belonging to no one, which is how the Australian continent came to be stolen, largely. It's a bit more complicated than that, but anyway, we'll just call it that for the moment. So the High Court overturned that doctrine and said the land did not belong to no one. People were here. They had active systems of law and governance and placemaking and very sophisticated ways of doing all of those things. And all of those things might still exist. They have not been extinguished by the arrival of British colonisers. So there was this kind of momentous decision. That decision has been translated into what we now call native title. Have you heard of native title? Some people? Good, excellent. If you haven't, native title, I'll give you some proper definitions in a minute. Native title is the recognition of the title that the Mabo decision gave rise to. So it is not a bequest of land rights. It's not the Australian state handing over land to people who've had land stolen from them. So it's not like that at all. It's different from land rights. It is the recognition that a form of title has always existed and did not get extinguished by the moment of colonisation or by the processes of colonisation. So native title is a really, really important aspect of land law, actually, for the planning system, because it's part of the recognition space in which the Australian polity, us, right, sees the particularities of Indigenous people, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the specific nations that make up those groupings. So it exists in that formal recognition zone. So there are many instances now in this contemporary relationship where planners and planning decision making must recognise that native title does exist or might exist and hasn't yet been determined, and act in certain kinds of ways to ensure that it doesn't do anything that it shouldn't in relation to that native title. So we'll stop there on native title because it then gets terribly complicated and legalese, and we don't want to go there. But this is this very important legal framework. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a general sense in a moment. The other terminology I just mentioned and said that native title wasn't is land rights. Land rights is a slightly different thing. It's related in some respects, but is also an important way in which the recognition zone comes to be, the contact zone comes to be, or the sort of formal recognition space. And that is when an Australian government of some variety hands back land to a dispossessed people. And then recognises that they have title to that land. Often that happens through the freehold system. So the people who receive that land hand back receive it as freehold title. Freehold being, the way you might own your house, for example. So you own it in a private property kind of sense in some ways. And sometimes it's handed back in other kinds of forms. It comes in a variety of tenures. But the struggle for land rights, or the dimension of land rights, is another important aspect of this formal recognition space. So this photograph is a very, very famous photograph if you're from here. And if you're not, let me briefly explain it. The white guy is Gough Whitlam, who was very briefly our Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister. in my view, one of the best Prime Ministers we've ever had, and oh, how I wish we could have him back. But anyway, we can't. And he famously made a very famous decision in 1974 to hand back land to Vincent Lingari's people. This is Mr Lingari, and recognise their rights in land after a very long struggle that actually started about wages and workers' rights. It was a labour movement originally, and then became a land rights movement, a very, very significant land rights movement. And we just celebrated its very important anniversary just recently, in fact, just earlier this year. So here is Whitlam pouring a handful of sand through Vincent Lingari's hands to signify the return of land to these people, into this particular group of people in this struggle. So we have native title and we have the land rights regime, and there are various different kinds of land rights regimes all around the country. They're very, very diverse. So the land rights forms that we have in Victoria tend to be around missions like Corandurk or Framlingham or Lake Tyers, which were all old mission stations, reserves, Aboriginal reserves where people were incarcerated, pushed to, but have now become very significant for people because it's where their lives unfolded and where their ancestors are from. And so some of those places have been handed back to Aboriginal forms of governance, if not usually traditional forms of governance like native title, but nonetheless. In the Northern Territory, where this event occurred, it's a quite different system of land rights, a little bit closer to native title, and very, very significant, and makes Indigenous nations, Aboriginal nations in that part of the country very significant landholders, in fact. So these two things, native title and land rights, have done a very interesting thing to the estate. If you think of Australia, the continent of Australia as an estate, have done a very interesting thing. So here's an interesting way to visualise that. Okay, so in 1788, when Philip Cook arrived, the Australian continent was made up of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations, right? This map shows Aboriginal nations, okay? It was entirely in the possession of Aboriginal people. By 1965, none of it was in the possession of Aboriginal people. None. Nothing at all. Now, that doesn't mean that, presumably, there were some Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who owned a house, who owned private property in perhaps the way we might do in this room, but none of it was owned under Aboriginal title, under their own title. Okay, so by 1965 it was a completely white nation in that respect, and in many other ways as well. By 1993, and then onwards to 2013, something started to happen. This land rights movement and the recognition of native title in 1993 and 1994 started to change the way that landscape now looks, the estate now looks, and we're starting to see a return of land or a recognition of the underlying ownership of Aboriginal people across the nation in quite significant and large amounts, actually, to the extent that this is almost the contemporary map. I think there is actually a very much more updated version than this very recently, but I couldn't grab hold of it in time. But this gives us a good indication of where land is held. So the red is what's called exclusive possession. You're just looking at the total of red and yellow together. They're just slightly different varieties of the same sort of thing, held under either native title or under a land rights regime. Depending, those two different ways of doing it. So this is now a very significant portion of the estate of Australia. Yeah, it's really, really amazing what some people have called a land tenure revolution. So for planners who are interested in the relationship between people and environment, people and place, and are actively intervening in how we think about how land is used and managed, its future, our future as a community, as a polity, these things are tremendously important because this changes the way we think, or should change the way we think, about what it is that is land in Australia. How else would we imagine that you know, this could... I can't understand how we could not think that this is tremendously important, I guess, is what I'm saying. Now, all of those things are predicated on the idea that and this is something I haven't talked about yet, that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous people generally across the world, there's big literature on this, and Indigenous people would say this, have a very particular relationship to place that is not like mine. It's not like my culture's relationship to place. My culture's relationship to place is fractured in different kinds of ways and it comes through particular kinds of lenses. It's usually about private ownership and individuals having private ownership, usually to speculate for wealth. Not that we all share that, that kind of value, but nonetheless that's how we might think about a particular cultural aspect of place. That's not generally how Indigenous peoples think of their relationship to place. So in order to understand the importance of this map for rethinking the nature of our responsibility, I speak as a non-Indigenous person, to what that map means, we need to understand what that relationship to place is. Now, I can't do that because I'm not an Indigenous person, so I have a cunning way to help us understand this so that we hear this from Aboriginal people's voices themselves. And so I just want to show you very briefly a small part of a little video that talks very beautifully about this relationship to place. And so I'll just start playing it and hope that it works. And we're just going to sit with that for a few minutes and then talk further. Yes, we can hear it. Good, good. Sorry. How do I get you to see that?
Get out of
One of the reasons it was used
this mode.
for
Yep.
There we are. Right, then it stopped.
really good pottery.
There it is.
The other thing about it is it's very good for your hands. If you handle this, put it on your feet, put it on your hands. When you wake up tomorrow morning, you'll notice the difference in your hands. Very good. This is so you can hear what I'm saying, but also hear what the country is saying. Like that Lewin Honeyeater just called then. It's not just a random call. That bird doesn't need us to hear it. It's chosen to let us hear it. And so now you can both see the country, hear the country, and hear and see what it's trying to tell you. And this is so you can understand what you're seeing and hearing. You're learning to understand the country. So that's, not very dramatic, but terribly important to Aboriginal people when you're entering someone else's country, or even your own, to remind yourself all the time, I must look, I must listen, and I must try and understand. So, it's an important part of this area. Country is trying to talk to you. It is actually trying to say something to you.
The video goes on to talk at more length about that, so I encourage you to have a look at it. If you Google interwoven, you'll find it, and we won't spend any more time on it here. But I want to alert you to, I guess, what for me is really important understandings from what that was the voice of Bruce Pascoe, who's a Bunurong man, an author and widely written, like, you should go look at his work. He's a terrific author. What he was saying about relationship to country in his terms. So the interwovenness of everything, the relationship of one thing to another, and our responsibility. He was talking, no matter whose country you're entering, even your own, from his perspective, that you are listening and learning and watching and trying to seek understanding from what country is talking about. So this very important relationship to place is part of what is being recognised awkwardly in this system of land rights and native title recognition. So just to come back again and just remind you again about what native title is, because this is really important for planning, especially because it's a property title, it's a property right and a tenure. So the things that native title is, it is a property right and a tenure. It is a recognition of surviving titles, surviving rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it is held in perpetuity. You can't sell it. It's not exchangeable in a market like other forms of title, and it's held according to the specific law and custom of the native title holders, of the native title holding body. For example, for the Yawuru people, who are the native title holders and traditional owners of the area around Broome in northern Western Australia, their native title is held specific to Yawuru law and custom, which would be different from native title being held somewhere here around Melbourne, which, by the way, it's not. Cities are particularly difficult places to have native title recognised. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So just to remind you that native title is not a grant of land like under a land rights regime. It's not a special measure. It's not a special bequest, because we often hear this in really racist discourse, particularly in this country, around how Indigenous people are apparently supposed to sort of get lots of goodies, get lots of things. It's not a special bequest. It is a recognition of something that has always survived and has always been there. And you can't exchange it. You can't sell native title. You can't sell the title, it isn't exchangeable. It's handed down through ancestral lines, and it's not easy to have recognised at all. Many native title cases and being heard through the native title systems across the country often take sort of 20, 30 years to come to some kind of agreement, and often are overturned. So one of the ways in which we might think about that in our own context, and drawing us right back to where we stand today and thinking about the barrack building, for example, is the urban question in this system of a formal recognition that sort of incites some kind of way of us as planners or land use decision makers to recognise that Indigenous people, that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are there, for a start, and that they carry with them and bring with them always their unceded sovereignty, that sovereignty matters in that context. So if this is the native title estate, what do you notice about this map? Where is native title mostly held, or land rights held? Whereabouts? Exactly, in the desert. In the big bit in the middle where white Australia thinks nobody is, right? And which white Australia largely doesn't want to be, because we're all snuggled in around the eastern seaboard, right? That's where urban development has happened. That's where settlement is at its most dense in places like where we live. So what I think we can notice about this map, if you look for, say Melbourne on this map, and look for Sydney, and look for roughly where Brisbane is, you can see that there's not a lot of action in the major towns, the major metropolitan areas in the Australian context. It's really, really hard for Aboriginal people to have their native title recognised when their territory, when their country has been completely built out by urban development. And one of the reasons for that is because when the native title legislation was formulated and enacted, of course, everyone, white people in Australia, non-Indigenous people in Australia, went absolutely cocoa bananas when the Mabo decision was handed down, right? They went apeshit and said, this can't happen. We cannot have our backyard stolen, was the famous phrase from the then Premier of Victoria, Jeff Kennett, who was concerned that suburban backyards would suddenly be full of, camping Aboriginal people or something with campfires, and he conjured all these extraordinary racist myths and ideas about what the outcome of this would be. So the legislative response was to say anywhere where there is private property extinguishes native title forever. So the private property in which we exist as a system extinguishes native title. So consequently, cities are really, really dense sites of contemporary dispossession. It's very hard to have native title recognised in cities because they tend to be saturated with private property. And so if you are Wurundjeri people on your country Naarm, it's very difficult to succeed in that regard. The other formal recognition space, I realise I'm running out of time, but we should talk about this briefly, that isn't to do actually with anything in relation to land title, is cultural heritage. And it's really important for planners to understand because it is one of the main ways, particularly in Victoria, that there is a contact zone, there is a recognition space between the planning system and Indigenous people. So this table, you don't really need to understand or look at the detail of it, but just shows you the types of cultural heritage legislative regimes that exist across all of the states and territories of Australia. In this context here in Victoria, we have the Aboriginal Heritage Act of 2006, which creates a particular kind of relationship between urban development, especially, and what's known as recognised Aboriginal parties, who are the organisations of traditional owner people, who have been recognised by the Victorian government to be the people who should govern the management and collection and storage and protection of their own cultural heritage. So what that gigantically long statement really means is that when soil is being dug up for usually large-ish urban developments like freeways, like big new residential estates, that kind of thing, or big ticket infrastructure and development, traditional owners must be involved in that process. So the Registered Aboriginal Party has to kind of be part of that and has to have a say over how it should happen. What it really means in practice, from the people that I speak to, Registered Aboriginal Party directors and archaeologists and people involved in the management of this, is that it really means that Aboriginal people have the right essentially to have dug up their old people's things, their ancestors' sometimes bones and sometimes their artefacts, the things that they created, the things that they made, and the places that are important to them, and usually put into shoeboxes to go into someone's garage. That's generally how that extraction protection process works. Some groups have resources and can put things in really special places, like keeping places or particular organisational environments, but quite a lot of things are dug up and people want to hold on to them because they're so precious to them as their cultural heritage, and they end up in weird, quirky places like the backs of people's garages. So planning considers heritage in this regard. So here we have this kind of recognition space, but it's a very limited one. If you think about how planning thinks of heritage, it thinks of it as built, so built form like the Malthouse, static, existed at some point and can never be touched, in the past rather than living, and should be conserved rather than modified. Or preserved rather than modified. So we do up old buildings to preserve them in their sort of original charm in order to celebrate their heritage. This kind of way of thinking about heritage does not sit well if you think of Bruce Pascoe's words from that little video about a relationship to country that is alive, that is growing and dynamic, that changes according to the context. it doesn't fit very well. So we have this kind of awkward recognition space in contemporary relationships between planning and heritage around this kind of stuff. I won't talk any more about that kind of recognition space, but I just want to bring things to a close by thinking about these kinds of questions. So if we're thinking about this relationship and we're using terms like planning by Indigenous peoples or planning for or with Indigenous peoples, we have to think about some kind of thorny questions that I've been kind of skirting around across this lecture. Where does the planning impulse come from? Who's the planner? Who says there has to be a plan? Why does there have to be a planning intervention? In the words of one of our First Nations collaborators when I was doing work in Canada, they would always describe their first question to a white government, a settler government that came to their door and said, do you want to be included? Do you want to participate in our process? They would say, who's going to hold the pen? Who holds the pen? Who's doing the writing? Who's the authority in this regard? And if it wasn't them, then they weren't interested in participating in the process, because it was simply an invitation to participate in further rounds of dispossession and further rounds of abrogating sovereignty and authority. So thinking about those questions about who's the ultimate authority, is sovereign over place, and whose principles and values are central is really, really important. We might think more about how we do this with Indigenous peoples, and I would have, if I'd had time, would have brought you a little case study on that, but I haven't got time. So I just want to think about some lessons, just very briefly, and then we'll have some discussion. The lessons for planning as I see it. We cannot think of, in a settler colonial context like Australia in particular, about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, or Indigenous people generally, as stakeholders. They're not stakeholders, they're first people. They're sovereign peoples whose sovereignty matters to every planning intervention. So they're not, like me as a kind of resident of a neighbourhood coming into a participatory process as a stakeholder. They don't have a stake. They're sovereign peoples, and that matters for how we think about that recognition zone or that contact zone. Planning has an obligation regardless of the formal recognition space or the legislative framework. So even though, for example, Wurundjeri or Bunurong people don't have native title recognised over the area of Melbourne, even though that is true, we still have an obligation as a planning system and as professionals in a space, in a context that's trying to manage the relationship between people and environment, we have an obligation and responsibility to Indigenous peoples, to Bunurong, Bunurong and Wurundjeri people. And that responsibility is likely to be deeply contested and very, very messy, because the legacy of colonisation is alive and well today. It was not a past event that happened a long time ago and now we're kind of all over it. It still exists today, and the kind of ongoing shadows of that are still terribly important, and that's why it gets messy and contested and challenged. And so the core principle that I think we should take away from this, and again, listening to and thinking about what Bruce Pascoe was saying in that short video, is that we must be respectful of country, of the place, of the people, of the culture and their sovereignty. And that's the core principle that we can bring to unsettle things like an inclusion and participation, and remember that sovereignty matters terribly. Thank you. And I'm sorry I went on a wee bit long. Maybe just.
Does anybody have any questions for Libby? I know you have to go quite soon.
I've got about 10 or 12 minutes, so.
10 minutes? Yeah.
So what do you think should be done with sort of like the road statue and places named after Batman and things like that going forward?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. I won't comment on the road statue. I think that one's done almost. I would like us to think more critically and reflectively about those kinds of memorials. So I'm not necessarily an advocate for tearing them down, because I think they could be really interesting and useful places for public education, but we would need to do that in a really sensitive way. So I wish that we could have a better conversation about what memorials mean and what they do. There's some really interesting counter-narrative memorials that you should go visit, like the one just near my office, which is at the top of the funny little laneway that runs through RMIT, the Tunaminaway Malawiina Memorial, which is it's sort of on Victoria Street. It's not far from the Barrack Building, actually. So go visit the Barrack Building and then walk up Victoria Street, up the hill a little bit, and you'll see it's a kind of weird-looking thing because it looks like it's sort of letterboxes. They're red and yellow and it's slightly odd. But it's a memorial to the site where the site of the first hanging of two people happened in Melbourne, who were two Aboriginal men from Tasmania. So that's an interesting kind of counter-narrative. So I think they could be used a little bit more reflectively. I wish we would stop renaming things and commemorating things after dead white men who did awful, awful, awful things, who were murderers and stole stuff. We should stop doing that. And I think it's responsibility for all of us to be more informed about our histories, about how we came to be here and who we are. We all have a responsibility for that and holding that to account.
So I gather that there's a Captain Cook memorial is just being proposed by Scott Morrison on the weekend.
Who else? Who else could propose?
A lot of money being put into this. He said it was going to countenance different sides of the story.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I wonder whose other sides of the story might be countenanced. Yeah.
How do we feel about people like Cook, or how should we feel about people like Cook, I guess is the...
I think we should feel, I'm not sure what we should feel about it. We should bring a critical understanding to our reading of that history. So certainly not as a kind of triumphal act of arriving in empty land and making it great and bringing a civilization to the soil, which is how that myth is told. And remember, of course, that the specific instructions that Cook was sent with were to go and see if anyone's there. And if you find people there, his instructions were from the British Crown, could you make a treaty or at least be nice and maybe talk and see how accommodating people might be to us arriving. That was his instructions. That was Philip's instructions when he was sent. It's extraordinary. And look at what we had. We had a very different version of history, so we need to be better informed about those things.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. That was just fantastic. The slide with the picture of Australia with the yellow and the orange I think is really a very powerful slide, and it's of course very concerning. But I suppose I'm not quite exactly sure what my question is, but I agree that sort of shows in the sense of native title, we've recognised the desert.
Yes.
But from an urban perspective, most of us all live in urban areas, I think 80% of us are in urban areas. And I agree we've got to take better responsibility around all of us more responsibility. But where are the spaces for the debate to have this? Because native titles essentially locked out the urban, but we've got a really big, we've always got a big issue here. Where's this discussion able to happen?
Yeah, it's a great
out
question.
the urban.
It's a great question, and it's really important. If you couldn't hear it over the jackhammer, essentially, if this is the case and the urban is locked out from native title and land rights, then how do we have a public debate about it? And what are we talking about if we're not talking about the actual recognition of underlying title, which we might not be because of these issues with native title? Then what are we talking about? So there are different ways to think about this. So I opened the lecture with what I think of as an acknowledgement to country, and you would have heard acknowledgements to country before, and you would have perhaps also heard a welcome to country from an elder of the place that you're being welcomed to. Maybe that's happened, in your inductions or whatever here, or in various other things. If you've been to the grand final, you've seen a welcome to country, usually done by Bill Nicholson, Wurundjeri elder. To me, the acknowledgement of country and the welcome, but our response as a non-Indigenous person giving an acknowledgement of country, is a commitment to precisely that discussion. It's not just a kind of politically correct thing that we've started to do at the beginning of stuff and then we kind of move on and do something else. it asks us to be in a certain kind of relationship. It demands a response to say, who are you going to be in this urban context? Now, that's a kind of easy, kind of abstract thing to say, and it might almost be easier to think about that for us as individuals, about how we might respond and the various different things that we might do. Go find out about the history of the place we live, for example. Make contact with people. Go along to things and learn. You know, go to talks by local Aboriginal people and learn about this stuff so that we're better informed. So they're all good things to do. But as a planning institution or as urban institutions, how do we have that discussion is what you're asking, and there's no easy answers to that. I think a lot of it is bound up in the question of sovereignty and treaty. So the treaty question in the Victorian context at the moment, there is an open discussion underway, I hope you know, between Aboriginal communities, Aboriginal nations in what is now Victoria and the Victorian government to strike a treaty. It's a really amazing step in all of this long history, because we've never had a treaty except for Batman's, which wasn't, right? We're not going to really call that a treaty. The context of treaty gives us a totally different framework to come at this question, because it doesn't lock it down into who can prove they were the right people at the right moment, which is what named title requires, at the moment of colonisation on this territory right here. Who was standing here, whose ancestors were standing here the moment white folk arrived and stole their land from them. Right? And you've got to prove your lineage to those people and not have any private property here as well. It does away with all of that and says, how can we recognise each other as sovereign nations and figure out how to create a contact zone, effectively, that is respectful of everybody's sovereign authority. And that's a really, really good step forward. So I think treaty actually provides us with the most important mechanism we've had for a long time, especially in the urban context, because it allows us to have this different kind of conversation. For example, it might allow us to have a conversation about planning gain. If you think of the wealth that has been extracted off a city like Melbourne, say a building like the Barrack building, think of the wealth that's extracted off that site over 200 plus years, right? None of that wealth has been distributed to the people it was stolen from. Could we figure out a way to tax land to enable reparations, redistribution of wealth to dispossessed peoples? That could be a treaty obligation. And that could create a different kind of conversation that we're having between, around this stuff. So those are the kinds of things that I think are present now. And we also have to create those ourselves, I think.
So how was the building approved?
How did the Barrack building come about? Okay. So it's a really interesting story, and I better not spend too long telling you. The building had sort of consultation, I want to use scare quotes for that, with Wurundjeri Land Council that got very messy because some of actually Barrack's descendants weren't involved in the conversation. So I think it was probably not very well managed from a number of perspectives. So there was a kind of consultation process, and Wurundjeri people did kind of give their okay with the image being put on the building. And then sort of immediately after that, after its unveiling, to use a colloquial term, and pardon my French, the shit hit the fan, and people got really upset because they didn't like the image as it appeared. They didn't feel like it looked enough like him. They didn't feel like they were involved enough in the conversation. The reason that it's Barrack's face on the building is also a very interesting kind of history, and I would love to do some more work on finding out how that came to be. The idea came from Daniel Grollo, who's the leader or the director or whatever, CEO or whatever of the Grocon property development company, and he wanted, they owned that site, and he wanted a kind of landmark, iconic building. And he'd seen, I think, there are similar buildings created with where the image appears out of the moulding of the balustrades of the balconies. That's how the image, it's not like an actual image on the building, it's why it appears more distinct as you move further away from it. He'd seen it on other buildings. There's a couple in the States, I think, and there's one actually with Nelson Mandela's face on it somewhere. I can't remember where, presumably in South Africa somewhere. So I think he'd seen this and gone, oh, that's cool, let's have that as our iconic building at the top of the civic spine. Quite how he came to think of having Barak's face on it, I don't know, and I would like to know a little bit more about that. I think he thought it was a grand gesture, and the way that the architects speak about it is that it's a grand gesture that makes visible, I'm quoting the architect here, the lead architect, it makes visible the absence of Aboriginal people in the city of Melbourne, right? It makes visible the absence, as if it was his job to make them visible, and as if they were absent, which of course they're not, because they're here, and they're continuing to practice their law and sovereignty and continuing to practice their culture. So it's a really extraordinary thing. The City of Melbourne, of course, loved it because it was this iconic building at the top of the spine, and it was going to look to the shrine, and it was going to do this beautiful thing, and there are all these pictures of looking from the shrine, and there's Barak peering down, and it's so wrong at so many levels. Anyway, yeah, that's a little bit more of a taste. You had a question.
Just a little question. How to provide open spaces to the narrative of Indigenous people? Because, I don't know, from my experience, in Colombia it's more confrontational.
Yeah.
So it's always go to the Supreme Court.
Yep.
They hear the case and they explain everything, but it's a way they against us.
Yep.
So yep. The broader population doesn't really know anything about narrative that people. And if we want something, a nation, a real nation,
Yeah.
we need to know their reasons and
For why they would take those cases.
Not only the Supreme Court, but to the broader population.
Yes, totally, yeah. And I think this is really, positioning different contexts alongside each other gives us really interesting insight into how come it looks like this here. How come this politics is practiced like this in this context and not, say, in Colombia? I've been doing some work in Chile recently, and again, the context around land rights and land claims is completely different. And people have Mapuche people in particular have a completely different way of describing the nature of their politics and what they're trying to claim, perhaps similar to the Colombian context or different. I think what's interesting here is the way in which Aboriginal people have managed to cultivate certain kinds of political conversations nationally and keep those conversations, by and large, alive. Not easily, right, but have managed to do that. So it hasn't, in this context, been, I mean, court cases have been tremendously important. Mabo is a terribly important court case. And there are lots of court cases all the time. Like, people are taking action through the courts all the time. We just don't kind of hear about it. But I think more importantly is the story and the politics that Aboriginal people have managed to kind of cultivate here that has a lot to teach us, I think, about how to do that. So I think, the Colombian context can, might be interesting to kind of put those things alongside those two contexts alongside each other and see what we learn from them. There are moments of deep confrontation, of course, between specific Aboriginal nations and communities and white institutions of government and corporations, of course. Mining is probably the one that engenders the deepest confrontation at this particular historical moment. Adani, for example. Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of related to that.
Yep.
What can we learn from countries like Canada and New Zealand that have, created
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Well, one of the stories that I was going to tell you and ran out of time was about the Gitnyao people who I worked with briefly a few years ago, looking at their relationship with the planning system in British Columbia. They're sort of central-ish, north central British Columbia. Really struggling with major kind of forest extraction industries, and were saw planning, their own planning, as the tool to control their own territory. And so they engaged in a conversation with the province, like the state, so like the state of Victoria, the province of British Columbia, about the recognition of their own system of governance for planning over their own territory, as the way that planning would be done in that place. And they won, effectively. They got it to happen through a long struggle. Like, that's a really truncated story, and it has its problems and awkwardnesses, but is a really amazing story that didn't require really formal recognition of underlying title, didn't require native title. Canada doesn't have that, but you know, the whatever the equivalent is, but enabled a different kind of conversation about this relationship. So we can learn things, I think, from those stories about how different First Peoples communities and nations are taking that challenge, like you know, in Colombia to the courts, and then what unfolds from that. So we need, I guess, more research. On that stuff. I would say that as a researcher, wouldn't I? Researchers always say we need more research on those questions. We need practitioners who are more aware and more willing to learn from those other contexts to see what might be possible, because as practitioners of whatever it is we're practicing, whether it be scholarship and research or anything else, there are always moments for creativity and doing and working outside, you know, the strict framework. Always, we can always find spaces to do things differently and create new forms of relationship. So we should be looking for those, and international contexts like Canada and New Zealand and whatever would help teach us some of those things. And treaty would be one of them. But interestingly, both of those contexts, you can't say that, people from both of those contexts would say, especially Indigenous people, would say, oh, we think we look to Australia for what we should do, which always horrifies me. Don't look here. Don't look to the Australian government for any kind of model on anything. That would be bad. But anyway, it's just interesting, that kind of comparative thing that we all do. We think everything's better somewhere else. Grass is always greener somewhere else.
Oh. Libby, I know you have.
How's that? Yes, I'm afraid I do. Sorry about that.
Thank you again for.
It's a pleasure. Lovely to talk to you all.
And sorry to everybody. I went looking for the source of that noise, and I've got to tell you, it's not happening. It's actually not happening, because I couldn't find anyone doing anything up there.
It's a social construct.
That is exactly what it is. Okay. No, do you mind if I grab your slides and put them on? Yeah.